Girls are often free to wear jeans, cut their hair short, or dress in shirts and boots, and society generally accepts this as perfectly normal, even empowering. It's seen as okay for a girl to adopt traditionally masculine styles or behaviors. But when a boy chooses to present himself in a way that's considered feminine, he's often mocked or looked down upon. Why? Because deep down, many still hold the belief that being a girl or expressing femininity is somehow lesser or shameful. Yet, beneath that judgment, there's a curiosity, maybe even a longing, to understand what it's truly like, what it really feels like to be a girl. Philosophy has never truly misunderstood the feminine. It has often refused to understand it at all. Plato envisioned a realm of ideal forms, a perfect world where the body was cast aside, rendering the physical and, by extension, the feminine irrelevant. Schopenhauer dismissed women as inferior, forming conclusions without ever considering their voices or experiences. Nature itself became a tool of abstraction, cloaking femininity in metaphor to keep it distant, mysterious, and ultimately controllable. Freud, too, failed to listen. He encountered silence not as an opportunity to inquire, but as a void to be filled with theory, labeling what he saw as absence and constructing meaning where he never sought understanding. For centuries, philosophy approached the feminine not as a subject worthy of inquiry, but as a problem to be sidestepped. It wasn't explored with nuance or care. It was swiftly categorized, rigidly defined, and kept at arm's length. Anything that didn't conform to the structures of logic was abstracted into symbol, stripped of its complexity. Ideas that disrupted the established order were framed as threats, and those that defied simplification were cast aside, ignored as if they had nothing to offer. In this way, the feminine became not a mystery to understand, but a concept to control. This philosophical approach didn't just shape ideas, it shaped the very architecture of thought. It influenced not only what was said, but how it was said, the tone, the form, the posture of control. Philosophers often wrote as if clarity demanded detachment, as if truth could only be reached by stripping away emotion, contradiction, and the presence of the body. In doing so, they built entire systems upon a narrow conception of reason, one that privileged stillness over movement, abstraction over lived experience, and silence over the layered complexity of real life. The result was a way of thinking that excluded much of what makes us human. The further a thinker appeared from the messiness of the human, emotion, vulnerability, embodiment, the more authority his voice seemed to carry. This framework didn't remain confined to philosophy texts. It seeped into the wider culture, subtly but powerfully. It began to influence how knowledge itself was structured, which voices were heard, which styles of language were deemed credible, and which emotions could be expressed without casting doubt on one's intellect. Over time, even feeling had to be curated, certain forms allowed, others quietly pushed to the margins, deemed too subjective, too disruptive to the illusion of pure reason. Over time, calmness came to signify authority. Composure was mistaken for intellect, as if staying emotionally untouched made a person more rational. Anything that felt too close to the body, too visceral, too intuitive, too raw, was quietly marginalized. You can still see traces of this today, in the way people adjust their tone during meetings, in the instinct to speak more softly, more carefully, to avoid seeming overly reactive. Thoughtfulness often gets conflated with emotional distance, and the ability to remain unaffected is praised as a kind of moral or intellectual strength. It's not always an explicit rule. Often it's just the atmosphere, unspoken, but deeply felt. Eventually, the absence of the feminine faded from awareness. It no longer needed defending, because it had been absorbed into the foundation. The omission became so familiar, so routine that it was no longer seen as exclusion, but simply as structure. What was missing didn't feel absent anymore. It had been folded into the shape of things. What passed for objectivity was often just repetition, and what resembled order was silence, rehearsed, refined, and repeated until it became the norm. Somewhere along the way, thought lost sight of what it had excluded in its quest to appear whole, and in doing so, it mistook its incompleteness for clarity. Some thinkers didn't ignore the feminine. They confronted it directly, but not in pursuit of understanding. Instead, they engaged with it to diminish, to reduce. Schopenhauer was among them. He made no attempt to disguise his views. To him, woman was not an equal intellect, not a complex or autonomous subject, but a biological deviation, a lesser version of man, deprived of reason, governed by instinct, and seemingly designed for submission. There was no metaphor in his language, no philosophical subtlety or restraint. He labeled her defective, plainly, confidently, without a trace of hesitation. His words carried no curiosity, no invitation to deeper inquiry. They read not like a theory to be explored, but like a sentence passed down, a final unquestioned verdict. To Schopenhauer, the feminine wasn't a force to reckon with or a symbol to interpret. It was a flaw, a misstep in nature. He saw it, not as something mysterious or meaningful, but as something incomplete. And once it was labeled that way, defined as lesser, it could be dismissed entirely. No need to engage, no need to listen. The label itself served as a gate, shutting the feminine out of serious philosophical conversation before it even began. It's tempting to treat this as a relic of the past, a regrettable but distant chapter in the history of thought. But ideas don't always stay confined to pages. They drift. They settle into the air around us, shaping how we speak, how we listen, how we judge. Some philosophies become atmosphere, quiet, pervasive, and unnamed. You can see their residue in how certain traits are still read as signs of weakness, in how a calm man is praised as wise, while a calm woman is simply called fortunate. In City, how authority continues to favor a particular stance, a particular tone, a particular absence of softness, as if strength still needs to be defined by its distance from the feminine. Schopenhauer didn't create this structure, but he gave it form and philosophical legitimacy. In doing so, he offered it weight, and with that weight came permission. Others no longer needed to question or examine. The judgment had already been made. He didn't present woman as a mystery to be understood, but as a settled matter, a closed case. And once something is framed as already known, already defined, it stops inviting inquiry. It becomes static, no longer a subject of thought, but an assumption built into the foundation. There's something deeply unsettling about the confidence in his writing, not just the cruelty, but the ease of it, as if reducing half of humanity to something shallow, something secondary, required no real effort at all. As if dismissing the inner lives of women wasn't a philosophical challenge, but a simple, self-evident truth. That ease is what lingers, not just in his words, but in the legacy they helped shape. Schopenhauer's view didn't disappear with time. It lingered, not always echoed word for word, but absorbed into the quiet architecture of credibility. It filtered into how seriousness is still assessed, into the persistent belief that logic has a natural home in certain voices, while others are dismissed as emotional, unstable, or biased. His words helped crystallize an attitude that continues to circulate. The idea that some people speak from reason, while others speak from reaction, and that only the former deserve to be heard without interruption, without suspicion, without being asked to prove their right to speak. Nietzsche didn't label woman as evil. not in the direct, condemnatory way others had. Instead, he placed her in a different realm altogether, one that was harder to define and, in his view, more unsettling. She wasn't cast as a clear adversary to be defeated, but as a force of disruption, something unpredictable that needed to be managed, controlled, contained. In his writing, woman became less a moral problem and more an existential one, an interruption in the order he was trying to understand. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche famously writes, "You are going to women? Don't forget the whip." It's a line that continues to unsettle, and for good reason. It doesn't merely imply dominance, it exposes the underlying tension in how Nietzsche perceived the feminine. Woman, in his thought, wasn't simply a figure to understand or engage with. She was a risk, a disruption, a presence that had to be preemptively managed. The line doesn't function as metaphor alone, it signals a fear of what feminine unpredictability might undo in the structures he valued. Control wasn't just suggested, it was assumed necessary from the very beginning. For Nietzsche, woman wasn't merely beneath man in a hierarchy. She was beside him, circling, close enough to unsettle, but never granted true equality. Her presence in his writing is elusive, yet charged, often appearing as instinct, seduction, softness, as forces that could blur the sharp edges of reason and clarity he was so determined to uphold. She wasn't framed as an intellectual partner but as a kind of atmospheric threat, not powerful enough to dominate, yet potent enough to destabilize. Her role was less about opposition and more about interruption, a presence that disrupted the clean lines of his philosophical vision. Nietzsche admired intensity. He celebrated it even, but only when it flowed through the channels he deemed worthy. The artist who transcends, the thinker who disrupts, the rebel who redefines. These were the forms of power he could respect. But the feminine didn't move through those same pathways. It arrived differently, through emotion, through contradiction, through presence that was intimate rather than distant. Its intensity wasn't forged in abstraction or defiance, but in closeness, in nuance, in the kind of complexity that couldn't be neatly categorized. And for that, it remained suspect, too uncontained, too immediate, too close. Nietzsche wrote frequently about the Dionysian, about chaos, ecstasy, and collapse, as vital forces that shattered illusion and reawakened the self. But even that, chaos was held within a framework. It had a purpose. It disrupted, yes, but only enough to spark transformation, not enough to truly overturn the order he valued. It was a chosen chaos, one he could philosophize through. Woman, however, represented a different kind of disruption. She wasn't a symbol he welcomed into his metaphysical architecture. Her presence brought a dissonance he couldn't convert into insight, a chaos he didn't summon and couldn't contain. She wasn't a metaphor for transcendence. She was something else entirely, unpredictable, unassimilated, and ultimately unwelcome. That discomfort hasn't disappeared. It still lingers in how we read emotion today. When men express emotional intensity, it's often reframed as something noble, creative fire, existential urgency, the mark of a passionate mind. But when women show that same intensity, it's read differently. It becomes volatility, unpredictability, a potential threat to stability. What is admired in one becomes a warning in the other. The reaction isn't always overt, but it's there, in the hesitation, in the subtle retreat, in the unspoken assumption that her feeling is too much, too close, too dangerous to trust. Nietzsche's work thrived on conflict, on the tension between instinct and reason, chaos and order. But when it came to the feminine, that tension didn't hold. It collapsed into rejection. He didn't seek to integrate the feminine into his vision of becoming or transformation. Instead, he pushed it to the philosophical periphery, not because it lacked substance, but because it refused to take the shape he trusted. She wasn't a mystery to be explored. She was an obstacle to be circled, a force to be managed. A presence that didn't yield to theory, and therefore couldn't Be absorbed into it. She became a boundary, not a partner in thought. A reminder that not all power can be controlled, and that what's left outside the system doesn't disappear. It lingers. It waits. And sometimes, it returns. Nietzsche didn't try to solve the feminine. He tried to outpace it. But not all thinkers turned away from the unknown. Some didn't reject it. They approached it, but not with openness. They didn't listen. They explained. And in that explanation, they reduced. Rather than sitting with complexity, they translated it into terms they already understood, stripping it down until it could be managed, categorized, neutralized. Their engagement wasn't about discovery, it was about control. And in seeking to define the unknown too quickly, they lost the chance to actually encounter it. Where Nietzsche turned away, Freud leaned in. He didn't avoid the feminine. He studied it, dissected it, theorized it. But what he uncovered wasn't clarity. It was confusion, tangled and unresolved, which he mistook for understanding. Instead of hearing contradiction as a sign to pause, he filled the gaps with theory, layers of interpretation that said more about his discomfort than about the subject itself. Freud once referred to the mind of a woman as a dark continent, not merely unknown, but mysterious in a way that demanded decoding. To him, her interior world wasn't a perspective to listen to. It was a problem to solve. Unmapped, unpredictable, and foreign in his eyes, the feminine psyche became an object of analysis rather than a voice with its own authority. Her experience wasn't something to be heard. It was something to be interpreted, translated into terms that fit within his system. She was never a subject in her own right. She was a riddle, and he believed he held the key. In Freud's world, the body was central, but only in the way it could explain everything else. Anatomy became identity. A missing organ became a missing force. Lack turned into theory. Silence became repression. Anger became hysteria. And from that chain of associations, a whole model of the feminine was born. Not from presence, but from absence. She wasn't studied as someone complete. She was approached like a question that kept giving the wrong answer. Her complexity wasn't met with curiosity. It was pathologized. When she spoke of discomfort, it became a symptom. When she didn't speak, it became a deeper one. Much of what Freud saw, he named. But the act of naming didn't bring understanding, it brought distance. His language was clinical, exact, and deeply rooted in the world he knew, one where male experience was the norm, and anything that deviated from it needed a reason to exist. And so he created reasons, theories that explained behavior not as adaptation but as failure, not as complexity but as compensation. He didn't ask what a woman felt. He asked what she lacked. He filled in the gaps with structure, diagnosis, mechanisms, until the feminine was no longer a person at all, but a diagram. You still see remnants of that model, in how discomfort, in women is still described as sensitivity, in how their boundaries are labeled avoidance, in how expressing emotion is treated as instability. The vocabulary changed, but the frame remained. Freud didn't set out to erase the feminine, but by treating it as an object to decode, he emptied it of its own voice. What couldn't be translated into theory was turned into error, and the more he studied, the less he heard. She wasn't missing. She was speaking in a language he never intended to learn. The fear wasn't about mystery, it was about recognition. The woman in their writings wasn't terrifying because she was unknown. She was terrifying because she mirrored something already familiar, something internal. Not a stranger, but a part of the self that had to be buried for the system to work. Jung came closer to naming this. In his work, the feminine appeared not just as an external figure, but as an inner presence, the anima, a force that lived in the psyche, often suppressed, often distorted. He described it not as weakness, but as depth, emotional intelligence, creativity, instinct, everything that had been denied in the name of structure. The philosophers who rejected the feminine weren't just rejecting others. They were rejecting what felt unstable in themselves, what couldn't be explained in linear terms, what felt too alive to control. vulnerability, longing, emotional clarity, the kind of knowing that doesn't follow logic but arrives through experience. They wrote systems that excluded those qualities and the people who carried them most visibly. This wasn't just intellectual resistance. It was psychological defense. Their rejection was a way of protecting something fragile, a way of drawing a hard line between what they allowed themselves to express and what had to be hidden behind theory. You can still feel that split in the way many people speak fluently about ideas but lose their footing when asked how they feel, in how certainty is praised and ambivalence is pushed aside, in how anything soft, exposed, or emotionally charged still has to justify its place at the table. Jung saw that what gets buried doesn't disappear. It shows up in other ways, in projection, in resistance, in distortion, and sometimes in philosophy. The feminine wasn't locked out because it had nothing to offer. It was locked out because it asked for something in return: proximity, risk, contradiction. It refused to stay at a distance, and in doing so, it threatened the illusion of control that many of these thinkers built their legacy on. This wasn't about understanding women. It was about avoiding themselves. The history of philosophy is filled with references to women, but not with their voices. They appear in metaphors, examples, diagnosis, as symbols of beauty, chaos, temptation, or failure, rarely as thinkers, almost never as witnesses of their own experience. This wasn't incidental. It was structural. For centuries, the role of speaking, naming and defining reality was reserved for men. They built the frameworks. They decided which questions mattered, and they decided who was allowed to answer them. The feminine was included only in the form they controlled. Everything else was edited out, not aggressively but thoroughly. Epistemic authority, the power to say what counts as knowledge, was filtered through a single lens. Logic was respected when it looked a certain way. Emotion was valid only when it confirmed the system, and lived experience, when it came from women, was seen as subjective, less rigorous, less relevant. Even today, that structure leaves traces. You see it in how some voices are still introduced with disclaimers, in how certain ways of knowing are framed as emotional and therefore unreliable, in how the language of analysis often takes priority over the language of experience, especially when the subject is the feminine. What's absent in the texts isn't just female authorship. It's the opportunity for women to define themselves on their own terms, to be seen not as an idea to interpret, but as participants in thought. Not symbols, not projections, not reflections, just voices, present, situated, direct. But that kind of presence was never neutral to the system. It required a shift in who gets to speak, in what kinds of knowledge are taken seriously, and in how philosophy understands itself, not as a closed loop of ideas, but as something that has always been shaped by who was missing from the room. The library isn't silent because no one ever tried to speak. It's silent because of who was expected not to. The quiet wasn't natural, it was curated, built not only by what was written, but by what was excluded. And that silence still echoes, not as absence, but as structure. It reminds us that erasure doesn't always look like force. Sometimes it just looks like tradition. Across centuries of philosophy, woman rarely appears as herself. More often she enters the scene as metaphor, as nature to be tamed, as temptation to be resisted, as fragility to be protected or dismissed, as disorder threatening the clarity of reason. She is cast not as a subject with her own voice, but as a symbol of what thought must rise above or bring under control. Her presence becomes rhetorical, not real, an idea to position against, rather than a perspective to engage with. That's the strategy. Turn her into an idea, and you no longer have to confront her as real, not as a person with a name, a history, a voice, but as a concept, a symbol, a function within a larger system. Once she becomes abstract, she no longer challenges. You don't have to engage with her specificity, with the way she thinks, feels, contradicts, resists, and speaks from the particular ground of her own experience. She stops being someone who disrupts and becomes something to interpret, to manage. to define. And in that move, from person to symbol, philosophy protects itself from the discomfort of the feminine being fully undeniably present.